Now, Freud believed that many of the patients that he saw, the female patients, had been sexually abused or molested as children. He wavered in that belief throughout his life and has been called to task rather severely for that by more current critics. But Freud was one of the first observers of the extreme malleability of memory, and he found it very difficult when he was interacting with his clients, especially the ones who were more hysterical in their essential orientation, to distinguish between memories that they had made up or fantasies and things that actually happened to them. And until you encounter someone whose memory structure is extremely incoherent and chaotic, it's almost impossible to realize to what degree people can wander around in the world with no sense whatsoever of what's happened to them. So, for example, I had a client at one point who told me that she thought she had been raped 5 times. And so, the first thing you might note if you heard a statement like that is that the word thought is a very peculiar insertion in that sentence, because it's not exactly all that straightforward to understand how you would have any doubt about that if it happened 5 times. So she was a very strange woman, and she was a person who was very much like someone Freud would have described in the late 19th century as a hysteric. She had virtually no catalyzed identity. She was, as far as I could tell, almost completely hollow, in that none of the things that had ever happened to her seemed to have been processed beyond the mere fact that they occurred. And I think that a big part of that was because she didn't really ever have anyone to talk to. And one of the things that's emerged as a consequence of Freud's work, in part, is a realization of the degree to which communication about your experiences is advantageous or even necessary in the maintenance of mental health. Now, Freud believed that you needed to talk about experiences that were particularly emotionally significant, partly because it was necessary to release or abreact the emotions that were associated with the experience. He called that catharsis. More recent research, particularly that done by James Pennebaker, has indicated that it's actually the articulation of those experiences, the verbalization and their transformation into a coherent representation, that seems to be beneficial for mental health rather than the mere expression of emotion. But just because Freud was only partially right about why his method worked doesn't mean he was wrong about the fact that it did work. Now, this woman was unemployed and had been for years, although she dressed in a business suit, and she had talked her way into hosting a cable television show in the town I was working with, in the city I was working in, that was a program about fostering the entrepreneurial spirit, even though she was unemployed and had never started a business in her life. And she had also talked her way onto a government board that was charged with investigating the development of a high-speed rail link in southern Ontario, even though she had absolutely no experience whatsoever with business or railways. So she had a reasonably well-developed persona from a Jungian perspective. I asked her at one point to show me her resume, and she brought me in a binder, you know, those 3-ring binders, that was 1.5 inches thick, with those little tab dividers that you use to segregate different sections of your CV, in which she had included a 20-page description of her recent dreams and a discussion or a list of all the novels she'd read in the last 10 years. She was completely incapable of noting that every single thing about that CV was inappropriate, even though she didn't suffer from any formal thought disorder. She wasn't schizophrenic or psychotic in any way. With regards to the rape statement, she told me that what happened to her frequently was that she would go to a bar in her vague and ill-defined way, and she'd have a few drinks, or maybe more than a few, and then she'd end up back at her place with some man, or at his place, and then that night they would have sexual relations, and then in the morning she was unclear about whether or not that was voluntary. Now this was a fascinating case for me because she outlined that story to me, and at this point I had become somewhat familiar with the danger of therapist manipulation of patient memories, because therapists can implant, so to speak, memories in clients. But it's very, very complicated, because when you're dealing with someone who's as chaotic and vague as this particular person was, it's virtually impossible not to implant memories just by talking about them. So I thought, she told me this story, and I thought, okay, I have a chance to reorganize this woman's entire conception of her past sexual experiences by uttering a variety of sentences. So I could have said, well, unless you give express consent to each stage of a sexual transaction, then you're clearly being victimized, and your claim that you may have been raped 5 times could be transformed into the claim that you were. Or I could have said, are you completely out of your mind? If you go to a bar, and a singles bar by yourself, and you have 6 or 7 drinks, or however many drinks you had, and you bring someone home or go to their place, and you end up in bed with them, and that happens 5 times, then probably you have something to do with it, and making a claim of rape is absurd. And then you might ask yourself, which of those opposing interpretations are correct? And it doesn't matter, because I didn't tell her either of them, because it was up to her to sort out exactly what had happened. Now, it's not that easy to believe that people like that exist, but they do. And she was someone who had never reflected on any of her experiences. She had no real articulated identity. And a big part of that was because she was completely isolated. And so, when Freud got confused about whether his client's memories of sexual trauma in childhood were accurate or inaccurate, the reason that he got confused was because he was frequently dealing with people who were confused right down to the bottom of their souls, and who, for one reason or another, had never been able to engage in the process of articulation that would have allowed them to establish a well-differentiated identity.